Good morning in the West, good afternoon in the East, and welcome to our mid-month Public Diplomacy Forum. I'm Adam Powell. I'm Executive Director of the Election Cybersecurity Initiative and Head of Washington Programs for the USC Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy, which sponsors today's program in association with the Public Diplomacy Council and PDAA, the Public Diplomacy Association of America. Jeff Cowan, the director of our center, started these mid-month programs with a mission of sharing information and exploring how we, individually and collectively, can help advance the practice, teaching, and study of public diplomacy. This program is being recorded and is on the record. Today, we welcome back to our virtual podium, Richard Wilke, the Director of Global Attitudes Research at the Pew Research Center. I believe you all have his bio. Today, we'll discuss the latest data on how the world views the president-elect, and there is much to discuss. So Richard, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Adam. Thanks very much for having me today. It's always a pleasure to work with USC. It's always a pleasure to engage with the public diplomacy community. I've had the opportunity a few months ago to speak to a version of this group, and happy to be back today to talk about some new work we've done on international perceptions of the U.S. in a new report we actually just released minutes ago. Released it at noon Eastern time, so it's hot off the digital press, I guess. So what I'll do is walk through some of the key findings from that report with you. As many of you know, what the world thinks of the United States is a topic we've done a lot of research on over the years at the Pew Research Center. And that includes documenting over the past few years, negative views towards President Trump around the world and the negative impact that's had on America's overall image. And this is clearly an important moment right now in terms of America's international reputation. We just had a tumultuous election. The Capitol was just stormed by a violent mob of Trump supporters. Tomorrow, we have the inauguration. We'll have a new president in the White House. And of course, as everyone on this call knows, the world's paying attention to all those things. So what we wanted to do with this survey is take an initial look at perceptions of President-elect Biden among three close allies of the United States: France, Germany, and the UK. Just to put a plug in for upcoming research, later in the spring, we'll do a larger survey. We'll look at more countries, we'll ask more questions, and have that data available later in the spring. But we felt like it was important right now to go in and at least get an initial look at reactions to the election and to President Biden among some of America's top allies. So what I'll do is walk through a few slides that highlight some of these findings. Let me start off by giving you just a little bit of background on the Pew Research Center and who we are and what we do. We've been around more than 2 decades now. We're funded largely by the Pew Charitable Trust. We do get funding from other sources, other foundations and things like that. We are nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-advocacy. We like to call ourselves a fact tank because we put such an emphasis on facts and data, empirical research, and we don't make policy recommendations. So that makes us a little bit different from other think tanks in DC and other places around the world. Here's just some of our core values that guide our research. In particular, the kind of work we do, things like rigor obviously are very important. Transparency is very important. We have to be transparent about the methods we use, the questions we ask, and all those sorts of things. Here are the research programs that we have at the center. I won't run through all of these. I'll note Internet and Technology there. My colleague Lee Rainey runs that program, and I know he's had some interactions with a lot of folks at USC over the years and has given some of these talks, I believe, in the past. The part of the Pew World I run is the Global Attitudes and Trends program, which looks at public opinion around the world on politics and economics and culture and a variety of different issues, including what people think of the United States around the world, what they think of China, what they think of other leading powers, and a whole host of issues around international politics, democracy, and a lot of the big issues that face the world today. Now, most important we're going to talk about is from this survey that I mentioned that we just conducted in 3 countries, France, Germany, and the UK. And you can see some of the methodological details of the study there. It was conducted from November 12th to December 23rd. So keep those dates in mind. That's after the election. It's after Biden is named and identified as the winner of the election. It's before January 6th. These are all nationally representative samples, so that means that the demographic profile of our samples very closely matches the demographic profile of a country's population in terms of age and gender and religion and region and all those kind of variables. We also have a little bit of data in here I'll share with you from a survey we conducted in November and December in the United States. Then I'm also going to talk a little bit about some data from a survey we conducted last summer in 14 economies around the globe. You can see the margin of sampling error there, pretty typical for these kind of public opinion surveys. And of course, during Q&A, I'm happy to answer any additional questions you have about the methods that we use. So let me start off before we get into the new survey, just briefly share with you some of the data we collected in this summer survey I mentioned that was sort of representative of what we tended to find about America's image during the Trump presidency. So in that survey, we asked these 2 questions in 13 advanced economies around the world. How much confidence do you have in Trump? And do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of the US? And these are median percentages across all 13 countries where we asked those questions. And as you can see, not much confidence in Trump. 83% across these nations said they lacked confidence in him. Just 16% said they had confidence in him. And not very good ratings overall for the United States either. 64% unfavorable, 34% favorable. Again, this has been typical of what we've seen over the last few years in terms of views about Trump and how people think about the US during his presidency. Now, in that same survey, we also asked about other leaders, and you can see that President Trump didn't do very well in terms of how his ratings compare with how people think about other leaders around the world. Again, these are median percentages across all 13 countries we surveyed. High ratings for Merkel, high ratings for Macron, mixed views about Boris Johnson, poor ratings for Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. But even compared to Putin and Xi, Trump gets more negative ratings. He gets the most negative ratings among any of the 6 leaders that we tested on the survey. And one other thing that we found this past summer was that something that was really driving the negative views we saw about the United States in the survey was how people perceived America's response to the pandemic. We asked people about their own country and whether it was doing a good job or bad job of dealing with the pandemic. People mostly said their own country was doing well, at least at that time. Of course, it could have changed since this past summer. People largely said the WHO was doing a good job of dealing with it. Same about the EU. People mostly said China was doing a poor job of handling the pandemic. But in particular, they said the United States was doing a poor job of handling the pandemic. 84% said the US was doing a bad job across the 13 countries that we surveyed. So it's a quick review of what we found most recently at the end of the Trump era in terms of what people were thinking about the United States. So let's pivot now to this new survey that we just conducted in the UK, France, and Germany, and look at how some things have changed. So here's that confidence question. We've now asked it about 4 different American presidents. How much confidence do you have in them to do the right thing in world affairs? This is a percentage who say they have confidence in Bush, then Obama, then Trump, and then Biden. As you can tell, we've seen some big changes over the years on this measure. If you go back to the Bush era, his ratings didn't start off very well, not too bad in Germany, but they went down over time. A lot of opposition in Europe to key elements of his foreign policy. He leaves office with some very low ratings. Obama comes in and gets these extraordinarily high ratings. More than 90% in France and Germany had confidence in him in 2009. His numbers move around a little bit over the years, but he leaves office again, very popular in these 3 nations, very popular in other parts of Europe, other parts of the world as well. And then you can see the steep plunge once Trump enters the White House in 2017. He gets very low ratings here, mostly low ratings in other nations that we surveyed in Europe and elsewhere. Again, his numbers move around a little bit over time, but they stay overwhelmingly negative, including in the survey we conducted last summer and asked about him, very low ratings for him in Germany, France, and the UK. And then you can see the new numbers where we asked about President-elect Biden. And overall, he gets very good ratings in these three nations. Big majorities in all three say that they have confidence in him. It's a big change from the Trump era. You look at Germany, for example, 10% had confidence in Trump back in the summer. 79% now have confidence in President-elect Biden. So a big change. Biden's not yet at where we typically saw ratings for Obama during his 2 terms in office. I think what we'll want to do there is wait until we do this survey in the spring and see, once Biden gets into office, how do his numbers look vis-a-vis the ratings we used to see for President Obama during his presidency. Now, just real quickly on Trump, why do we see these negative ratings over time? It was a few different things. It was in part his personal characteristics. People tended to say he was dangerous. People tended to say he wasn't qualified, that he was arrogant, but it was also his policies. People didn't like the fact that the U.S. was withdrawing from international agreements on things like the Paris Climate Accords, withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, pulling out of trade agreements. Those things were very unpopular. In addition, people didn't like to see the U.S. putting up barriers between itself and the rest of the world, whether that's a border wall on the U.S.-Mexico border, or it's in terms of making it more difficult for people to migrate to the United States. So those are some of the things that drove negative ratings for Trump. Very different ratings, early on at least, for President-elect Biden. We also see a lot of optimism in terms of how people perceive their country's relationship, their country's future relationship with the United States. More than 8 in 10 in France and Germany say they're optimistic about the future of relations with the U.S. It's more than 70% in the UK who hold this view. So there's pretty high expectations for the incoming administration in terms of bilateral relations between these nations and what in the United States. Now, one thing that's interesting is there's also a lot of optimism on this side of the Atlantic. 73% of Americans say they're optimistic about the US's future relations with European countries. And that's especially true among Democrats. 83% of Democrats say that. But even among Republicans, it's a majority. It's a very solid majority. 62% of Republicans are optimistic about relations with European countries as well. So even though Republicans may not be excited about a Biden presidency, they are optimistic that things are going to get better in terms of relations with our European allies. Now, we also wanted to ask about people's expectations in terms of particular policy areas, foreign policy, climate, and America's response to the coronavirus outbreak. And as you can see, people are pretty optimistic. We asked whether you expect this policy area to improve once Biden's in the White House, get worse, or not change. And very few people say these things are going to get worse. Instead, you've got pretty consistent and fairly large majority saying they expect things to improve. And that's especially true when it comes to the coronavirus. You have 7 in 10 or more in France, Germany, and the UK saying they expect America's response to the pandemic to get better during a Biden administration. And as we saw a minute ago, that's important because certainly, there are very negative perceptions of how the U.S. has been handling the pandemic. So it's clear that, at least in these 3 countries, people think things are going to get better. They think America's handling of this challenge is going to get better under President Biden. Now, here's the long-term trend on what's our sort of baseline measure of what people think about the United States. And as you can see in these 3 countries, we've seen movement on this question over time. The UK tends to give the US a little bit more positive reviews than what we see in France and Germany, but all 3 have had a similar pattern over time in the sense that ratings for the US dipped overall, became more negative during the George W. Bush presidency. They bounced back to some extent under Barack Obama, and then turned down again under President Trump. And especially they turned down in that summer 2020 survey. You can see a kind of a dip there in the summer of 2020. If you take France, for example, only 31% in France had a favorable opinion of the US last summer. That ties the lowest number we've ever seen there. You can see another dip around 2003. That was the survey we conducted in March of 2003 in the run-up to the Iraq War, when there was a lot of tension between France and the United States, a lot of tension between the US and some of its key European allies, a sort of high point of anti-Americanism in many ways. And, we see the same low rating in the summer 2020 poll in France. Same thing's true in Germany. Same thing's true in the UK. A similar low point in summer of 2020 compared to what we saw back in 2003 around the onset of the Iraq War. Now, excuse me, one other thing on this slide is that, of course, the numbers have bounced back a little bit in the most current survey, but as you can tell, they haven't quite bounced back yet to what they were typically when Obama was in the White House. So, it's kind of this strange transitional moment right now, right, where we're between two presidencies. So I think what I want to do on this question is take another look at it in the spring survey and see, once Biden's in office, does that favorability rating come back even more? Does it look similar to what we see under when President Obama was in office? Or does it not bounce back all the way and stay lower than what we saw back during the Obama years? Now, this is a question that highlights the extent to which publics in these three countries see real problems with the way American democracy is working. We asked people, do you think the political system in the United States needs to be completely reformed? It needs major changes. It needs minor changes, or does it need to be changed? And as you can tell, big majorities in all three countries say it either needs major changes or needs to be completely reformed. So, and keep in mind, this survey was conducted before January 6th, right? So this tells us that people already saw problems with the functioning of American democracy before the assault on the Capitol. And to some extent, it fits in with a broader pattern of what we've seen in recent years in terms of people having real questions about how well the American political system is working. And I want to share with you one example of that here in this next slide. This is not from the survey we put out today, but it's a trend that I think kind of reinforces this notion that people see problems with American democracy. And this is a question we've asked a number of times over the years. Do you think the US government respects the personal freedoms of its people? And this is the percentage of people who say, yes, I think the US government does essentially respect individual liberty. And as you can tell, for the first several years we asked this question, big majorities in all three countries said, yes, I do think the US government respects individual liberty. But it's declined in recent years. It declined during the Trump era, but it actually started declining back when Obama was president. We first saw a fall on this measure around the time that the NSA story broke, the revelations from Edward Snowden came out. We saw further declines on this question following the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, the issues around racial injustice that were raised, protests in Ferguson, Missouri, et cetera. So as you can see today, you've got minorities now in the UK, France, and Germany, in 2008, saying they think that the US respects personal freedom. So this is something that used to be a strong suit of America's image. It's declined in recent years. And it fits in this overall pattern of people maybe not seeing American democracy working as well as it should. Then there's one other topic I wanted to touch on because I think it's relevant as Joe Biden enters the White House. A lot of what I think people around the world are looking for from Biden is a more multilateral approach to foreign policy, more of an emphasis on international cooperation. So I wanted to share with you just a little bit on some data that we collected, again, in this summer survey we conducted in 2020. looking at some issues around multilateralism, because I think they're relevant to a lot of what the Biden administration wants to do. These are median percentages across all 14 countries that we surveyed last year, and on some questions about multilateralism, essentially. The first one's about coronavirus and global cooperation. If our country had cooperated more with others, we would have had fewer cases in our country, or do you think that no amount of cooperation would have reduced the number of cases? And by and large, you find majority saying they think that had their country cooperated more with others, they could have had fewer coronavirus cases in their own nation. So people see a value of global cooperation when it comes to the pandemic. Another question on international cooperation, which is closer to your view? Our country should take into account the interests of other countries, even if that means making compromises, or our country should follow its own interest, even when other countries strongly disagree. And again, by and large, people tend to say we should take into account the interests of others, even if that means making some compromises. So again, another measure of support for the principle, at least, of international cooperation. And then finally, another one that we asked, should countries around the world act as part of a global community that works together to solve problems, or should they act as independent nations that compete with others and pursue their own interests? And overwhelmingly, when we ask this question around the world, what we tend to see is that people believe in this idea of a global community that works together to solve problems. Something else we've seen is favorable views overall towards multilateral organizations. Here, the example is the UN. You can see the percentage of people in each of these countries with a favorable or unfavorable opinion of the UN. It's majorities everywhere except for Japan is an outlier, but for the most part, people have a positive view of it. We also see especially positive views about international cooperation and multilateralism among young people. So, this looks at some of these questions we've been talking about, but breaking it down by age. So if you look at the percentage of people with a positive view of the UN, it's 72% among 18 to 29-year-olds. It's positive among the other age groups as well, but it's especially so among those younger respondents. Same thing's true when we ask about the WHO's response in terms of dealing with the pandemic, especially positive views among young people. That question where we ask, do you think your country could have had fewer coronavirus cases had it cooperated more with other nations? 18 to 29-year-olds are especially likely to say yes. So overall, the principles of multilateralism are popular, and they're especially popular among young people. However, what we also see is that people have real, some concerns about the way multilateralism works. You can see a little bit of that here in this question we asked about the UN. And again, these are median percentages across the 14 countries that we surveyed last year. Do you think it promotes human rights? People tend to say yes. They also think it promotes peace and economic development. It deals with infectious diseases like coronavirus. It promotes action on climate change. But if you look down at the bottom there, you can see some areas where people are a little less likely to say good things about the UN, essentially. They're a little more divided on whether or not it cares about the needs of ordinary people, and they're more divided on whether it deals effectively with international problems. And this tends to be a common pattern that we see when we ask about multilateral approaches, multilateral institutions. People think they stand for noble goals, but they also think they're a little bit out of touch with ordinary citizens, and they don't always work effectively when it comes to solving international problems. And just one more slide on this theme of multilateralism. Here's that favorability question that we asked about the United Nations, just in the US, looking at the differences among Democrats, independents, and Republicans. And this is a question now we've been asking for 30 years. And as you can see, we've always found a partisan gap when it comes to views about the EU, but that gap has gotten much wider in recent years, especially over the last decade or so. So in this most recent survey we conducted, 85% of Democrats said they had a favorable view of the UN. It's just 39% among Republicans. So, one of the many, many areas in American public opinion where you see a sizable gap. So to me, this highlights some challenges that people who are proponents of international cooperation face in terms of it being a fairly partisan issue in the U.S. And even though people believe that these kind of institutions and approaches are aimed at noble purposes, they don't always feel like they're effective, and they feel like they're a little bit out of touch with average citizens. So, just to wrap things up, I think there's at least three big takeaways from some of what we've found. First of all, there's a lot of optimism when it comes to the incoming administration. A lot of optimism when it comes to President Biden, a belief that he is going to improve specific policy areas in terms of American policies. And that's a big change from the Trump era. Second, at the same time, there's a lot of concerns in these nations and these close allies of the United States about the health of American democracy. People see real problems with the political system and the way democracy is working. And again, just to note, that's before what happened on January 6th. And then, third, I would just point out that again, President Biden obviously is going to put much more of an emphasis on international cooperation and multilateralism. And I think there's a real desire for that among the publics around the world that we survey. They sort of want more multilateralism from the United States and more international cooperation to solve global problems. But I think it's important for people, again, who are proponents of international cooperation to keep in mind that people do see issues with it as well. Specifically, they believe that multilateral organizations and approaches aren't always effective, and they think those kind of approaches can be not very closely tied to the needs of ordinary citizens. So, and the challenge for those who want more multilateralism and more cooperative approaches to solving international challenges is, I think, to show that it can be effective and to show that it does address the real needs that average citizens have. And as I said, also I'll put in one more plug for our later work. We'll stay tuned. We'll have more on America's image later in the spring, but I think this survey that we just put out today gives us a good look at some initial reactions, at least, to the incoming administration. And I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Richard. And we have a number of questions and raised hands already. Why don't we begin with Sherry Miller, who has a question about methodology. Her question is, how was this done? Was this done by a telephone? And do you see any signs of survey fatigue?
Yes, these are all done by telephone. These nations are talking about today are all countries where we typically do telephone surveys. The real challenge we're facing right now is that face-to-face interviewing isn't possible in countries around the world during the pandemic. So there's parts of Latin America and Africa and Asia, the Middle East, where we normally survey, where right now at least we're not able to because of the pandemic, and you can't send interviewers around to people's homes, obviously, while the pandemic is raging. So those are the kind of countries where we face some real problems. But in telephone survey nations, we're able to do this work pretty well. In terms of fatigue and things like that, you do see lower response rates than you would like in many nations. So in the U.S., for example, we've gotten lower response rates over time on the phone. So we've built our own probability-based panel in the U.S. that we use now for the bulk of our survey work, and our global attitude surveys in the U.S. are going to move on to that panel next spring as well. So it continues to be something we're thinking about, and over time, what we're going to do is experiment more with online surveys in other countries as well, as phone response rates continue to decline in many nations. Moving to online surveys, I think, will be what we do, and it's already what a lot of pollsters are doing.
We have a raised hand by Greta Morris. Greta. And you need to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you for a really fascinating presentation. I had two questions. First of all, I'm wondering if you were able to get any information on whether these audiences felt that the U.S. election, the recent election, particularly presidential, was free and fair. Did they have trust in the results of that election? And then secondly, did you find any views on the election of Kamala Harris as the first female and first person of color elected as a vice president of the United States? Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, those are great questions. I wish we had a little bit more on both of those things. We have not asked about Vice President-elect Harris. That would be a good question for us now to look at, I think, in a future survey. It would be very interesting to see reactions to her. In terms of was the election free and fair, we don't have anything specifically on that. I think the most we have is that one question I shared, which is that people see some real problems with the political system. We'll have some more questions about sort of perceptions of American democracy coming up in our next survey. I have seen some data from a survey that the Kerber Stiftung conducted in Germany following the election, which I think essentially showed that people felt like the election had weakened sort of their confidence in American democracy. So there's some data out there at that level, but not some. I haven't seen anything yet on what do people think about the fairness of the election and that type of thing.
Thank you.
Michael Anderson, if you can unmute. I know you have at least a couple of questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. I appreciate your comments and your excellent Pew results. I think you do a good job distributing those. My question is a little broader, and that has to do with American culture. Do you have any data or any thoughts on how American culture is being perceived around the world these days? Has it lost its shine? Is the good old days when everybody loved American movies, films, etc.? Are those days over?
Well, we have asked some questions about this. It's been a couple of years, but we've asked about them during the Trump era, for example. And what we saw is that there's a question we ask about American popular culture. Essentially, do you like or do you not like American movies and television and music? And we've typically seen, with some exceptions around the world, people say, yes, I do like American popular culture. The percentage of people saying, yes, I like it, declined after Trump was elected, but it still remained pretty strong. Even at a time when people weren't very happy with the U.S. in lots of ways, they continued to say they like American culture. So, it's time to update some of those numbers again, look at it again. But, what we saw during the Trump years is that people continued to like American culture, even if they were unhappy with lots of other things. Now, it is a flip side to it as well. And what we've seen in our research, at least, is that there's another question we ask people: do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing that American customs and ideas are spreading here? And there, people often say it's a bad thing. So on the one hand, they like American popular culture. They want their American music and their American television and all these great cultural products that America creates, but they worry about it kind of pushing out their own culture as well. So, as a sort of attraction and resistance that people feel about America in some ways and about American culture in some ways, I think you see that reflected in our surveys.
Thank you.
Okay, I see a raised hand from Brian Carlson. Brian.
Yes, I wanted to ask whether you are ever tempted when you get these indications that people are confident or lack of confidence in the future or in a candidate or something. Do you ever ask why they feel that way?
Yeah, so I think we try to get at it in different ways. You can try, and for surveys in this kind of research, you can attempt to do it different ways. I'm always a little reluctant to directly ask people why, because I think then what you get often are people aren't that great at analyzing why they think something often, right? They'll give you kind of a rational explanation when in truth it's maybe not entirely rational how they feel about a given topic. So the way we usually try to do it is ask a lot of questions about a topic and piece it all together. So it's clear, for example, that when you're asking about the United States, well, what drives those sentiments? What is it that shapes how people feel about the U.S.? It's a lot of different things. Primarily, I think it's policies, right? That's what we've seen really change the needle in one direction or another over the years, right? What's America's approach to the world? How is America using its vast power in world affairs and things like that? So, American actions, American policies matter a lot. Who's in the White House, who's making those decisions matters a lot. But it's also other things too. It is these more soft power type of aspects of America's image. It is culture. It is how you think about American science and technology and things like that. So, it's kind of the short answer to your question, I guess, is we try to ask about a lot of different aspects of a topic and piece it together that way, rather than sort of asking an individual, okay, tell me why you feel that way.
Right.
And thank you, Brian, for always having the most idyllic background. Matt Wallen.
Thanks. Sort of a two-part question. First, in terms of sort of the next round of questions post January 6th, are you considering integrating certain questions that address the Capitol attack and people's perceptions directly with relation to that? And secondly, because it's related, have you considered asking sort of about the role of information or disinformation and people's perceptions around this ideas in terms of how they're perceiving these various countries? I mean, if you're comparing the US and China and favorability, you'd think disinformation would be a factor within that perception.
Yeah, those are definitely things we want to try to look at. I think, in particular, and in terms of the next kind of question we might ask, questions about American democracy, is it a model or is it not? Was it ever a model or was it never a model? Those kind of questions I think we want to ask about to get a little bit more at how people see the health of American democracy at the moment. Disinformation, misinformation, those kind of things. We haven't done as much of that type of research internationally as we have, domestically at the center. But, we would like to look more, I think, in the future in terms of where people are getting their information and how that affects views about various topics, including the United States. It's difficult to do because you have to spend a lot of time in your questionnaires asking people about, news sources and those kind of things. So it's a sort of time-consuming component of doing a survey, but we'd like to look at it more. Yeah, I'd note that, you mentioned China. I mean, one thing that we've seen, especially over the last year, but the last few years, is that, it's not just the United States that people in Europe and elsewhere have a negative view about right now. It's also China. Just like we saw some record lows in the summer 2020 survey for ratings of the United States, we also saw some record lows in many of the same places for in terms of ratings for China. So, as Biden's entering office, he is, inheriting a situation where the United States has been getting very poor ratings in Europe in particular and other parts of the globe too. But it's also, this is a sort of context in which the other major superpower out there is also facing a lot of, reservations among publics around the world too. And ratings for China are pretty negative in many of the countries we survey right now, and often as negative as we've seen them.
Tish King, you can unmute.
Thanks so much. This is really very interesting, and it's helpful to see the changes and trends over time. I'm curious, Richard, the focus on the comparisons was on European countries. If you have any insights for other regions, in particular Asia and maybe our neighboring countries of Canada and Mexico.
Yeah. It's, of course, we try to be as global as we can in our work and survey, other regions over time. As I know, like right now, one of the challenges has been the pandemic in certain parts of the world, because we do face-to-face interviewing, but we're we're anxious to get back into the field in Latin America and in Asia, Africa, other parts of the world where we do those face-to-face surveys. In looking back at what we have found during the Trump era in some other parts of the world, I mean, you mentioned our neighbors. In many ways, Canada looks a lot like what we've seen in Europe. I mean, if you looked at the trends over time on confidence in the president, if you looked at favorability rating for the United States, views about American foreign policies, et cetera, the Canadian numbers look, maybe a little different, but a lot like some of the numbers we were looking at today from Western Europe pretty often. Mexico is a place where we saw, very big changes once Donald Trump came into office. I mean, he, some of the biggest drops in terms of ratings for the United States took place in Mexico following Trump's election. Building the wall, the border was not very popular. I think it was 95% in Mexico said they opposed that. Trump, 3 years running, I think, got his lowest ratings around the world, among the countries we survey at least. In Mexico, I think his favorability rating was around 5, 6, or his confidence rating was around 5, 6, 7%. So, Mexico is a place where, in terms of public opinion, at least, you saw a big shift for president in terms of views about the president once Trump took over. And we want to go back now and see what happens since Biden is in the White House. We haven't been back to Mexico yet. Briefly, some other parts of the world. I mean, one I would note would be Sub-Saharan Africa, which is an interesting region when it comes to America's image, because at least in our research, we don't always see as big a changes in Sub-Saharan Africa that we see in other parts of the world. You do see some movement, but by and large, throughout the time we've been polling, the U.S. has gotten positive ratings in Sub-Saharan Africa. President Bush was reasonably popular there. Obama got even higher ratings. Ratings for Trump went down in Sub-Saharan Africa, but they were still much higher than what you tended to see in other parts of the world. So again, another part of the world we're anxious to go back to. Israel's another interesting sort of case. It was one part of the world where one nation where President Trump got pretty high ratings, and he actually got higher ratings than what we saw for President Obama sometimes when he was in office. So Israel, again, another country we're anxious to get back to as soon as we can. So I guess that's a quick highlight of some of what we've seen from other parts of the world. But if you have questions about other regions, I'm happy to try to answer those as well.
Greta Morris has another question. And you need to unmute.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And this may be too granular, but I'm just wondering if in the question about views of US democracy, if you were able to find out anything about how these audiences view the Electoral College, which of course has gotten a lot of bad publicity in the United States since the election, well, even before. And if you didn't find out anything this time, if that's something that might be considered for the next survey.
Yeah, that would be a good suggestion to try to break down a little bit the American political system. Right, we've asked about it overall, and of course if you get too granular, you probably lose some people, right? In terms of being too specific about the American political system. But maybe something like the Electoral College or certain aspects of our system would be good to work with. Good to ask questions about. We haven't really tried that yet, but we should. Like many of you, I'm sure. I've been overseas explaining something about the United States and our political system, and trying to explain the Electoral College to people isn't always the easiest thing, right? So we have to be careful, I think, about how complicated our questions get. But it would be good to break down, some of this a little bit more and say, what does it people like? What do they not like about the American political system?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, I don't see any more hands raised, and we always want to be mindful of your time, even though we don't have to drive across town anymore or take metro. But thank you very much, Richard, for your hot off the digital press data and discussion. This program was recorded, and if you missed any part of it, you'll be able to see it. It'll be posted on the USC website, and we'll send around the link. The next program that we are going to present is our regular First Monday program with the PDC and PDAA, and the guest on the first Monday in February, Monday, February 1st at 12 noon Eastern Time, will be Ambassador Stuart Holliday, who's the President and CEO of Meridian International Center. So until then, thank you for joining us, and we're adjourned.